All right, hello, Mayim.
Hello, Rabbi Jim.
All right, good to see you, or good to see your picture at least, if not you.
I'll get the video up there.
Not a problem. All right, so we'll wait just a few more minutes. We'll see if there's a few more folks joining us, and then we will get going. Oh, we lost somebody there.
Andrea.
We lost Andrea. Thought she was going to stick around. All right, well, maybe she won't. All right. Right, that's it. There it is. Okay, all right, so I think we'll get started so as not to waste people's time. And let's see. Oh, Andrea's back. Hello, Andrea, you're back. All right, so so today we're going to talk about post-biblical holidays, and we'll do it, I think, by sort of we'll start just by having an opportunity for people to sort of name some of these post-biblical holidays, and we'll try to think about, how do they fit into our yearly cycle, and then we'll go into a little bit more detail about some of the questions about that we might ask, most of them, right, will have some actual history or kind of history associated with them, right? And what do we do with that? And how does that make them different than the holidays that we celebrate from the Torah? All right, so why doesn't somebody give me a sense of, like, okay, what are the holidays we're talking about? What are these post-biblical holidays? Who has an idea?
You mean what are they, or how?
Yeah,
are they
just
different?
what are they? What are they? Yeah, which ones?
Yom HaAtzmaut.
Great. Yom HaAtzmaut.
What?
Ah, great. So what is Yom HaAtzmaut?
Israel independence.
Israel Independence Day. So when would that holiday have been instituted?
After May 1948.
Right. So after the establishment of the state of Israel, right?
What day was it? What day was it? May 19th?
Well, I mean, when the day itself was actually instituted as a holiday, I'm not 100% sure, but the Yom HaAtzmaut was, Sandy, say it again when it was?
May 1948.
Right. So in May 1948, right, the state of Israel declared independence, right? And so now every year, right, a week after Yomashawa, right, and Yom Hazikaron, right, we have in Israel Independence Day, right? So I've just named two others, right, Yomashawa and Yom Hazikaron, right? These are also modern holidays. The first one, Yomashawa, is what in English we would call, Holocaust Remembrance Day, right? Even though I tend to use Shoah as opposed to Holocaust. The Hebrew word somehow is more resonant for me than Holocaust. And Yom Hazikaron, right, is Israel Memorial Day, right? The Day of Memory. And so that is the day when we commemorate all of the soldiers and other people who lost their lives fighting for Israel's independence and continued security, right? So those are very modern holidays, right? We can't have Yomashawa, right, without having experienced, God forbid, the Shoah, right? So what those holidays look like, right, and to what degree they will be, they will endure, right, beyond being holidays associated with the state of Israel, right, are questions, right? Because they are still less than a century old. And so these are really, talk about post-biblical, right? These are really post-biblical holidays. All right, how about some other ones?
Purim.
Purim, exactly. Right, so Purim is not a holiday that's mentioned in the Torah, right? It's obviously, it derives from the book of Esther, right? From the scroll of Esther, but it's and it fits very neatly into the holiday cycle, right? But it definitely is not a Torah-itic holiday, right? And we'll get to Purim. We just celebrated Purim last week, right? And Purim is a holiday that it's a complicated holiday. I mean, most holidays are a little complicated, right? But Purim is especially complicated, right? For a number of reasons. All right, how about some other ones? Hanukkah, right. So Hanukkah, even more, right, than Purim, is post-biblical, right? There's no mention of it in the Bible, right? Purim, you can say, okay, you know, it wasn't really a holiday, but it was something, you know, it was something that was mentioned in the Bible. There's a whole book about the events that we commemorate, right? But the events that we supposedly commemorate for Hanukkah, right? There's no mention of them in the Hebrew Bible, right? And there's no ancient source that has like the whole story of Hanukkah as we understand it, right? There's no ancient source that has the whole thing, right? So that's, you know, the story that we tell at Hanukkah, right, is sort of a compilation from a bunch of different sources, right? And we can understand, just like with Purim, right, we can understand Hanukkah in a lot of different ways.
I think one of the things that, as I'm thinking about it, I kind of like the post-biblical holidays because there's no commandment of how to celebrate it. You can't do it wrong.
Right. I mean, in a certain sense, you're absolutely right.
There are minhagim. Do you light from left to right or right to left? Do you start with 8 candles? Do you start with 1 candle?
Right.
But you're not gonna, you know, the lightning bolts are not gonna come down on you for doing the holiday wrong.
Right. Well, you're getting at something, Lori, which I think is really, really important, right? Which is that distinction, right, that you're drawing between the biblical holidays and the post-biblical holidays, right? On one hand, you're absolutely right, right? On the other hand, right, the things that you can get wrong in the Torah-itic holidays, right, is that you won't do the sacrifices correctly, right? And we don't do sacrifices, right, for anything anymore, right? So Rosh Hashanah, right? For Rosh Hashanah, we read last week, right? It's the day of the Teruah, right? It's the day of the blowing of the shofar. How? What else do we do? Right? So in a very significant sense, the distinction between the Torah-itic holidays and the post-Torah-itic holidays, right, is really just when we started celebrating them. in a certain sense, what the way, doing them wrong, right, has for, at least for Rabbinic Jews, and most Jews today fall under the category of Rabbinic Jews, right? Unless you happen to be a what's the word I'm looking for? A Samaritan, right? Or a what's the other? There's another group that don't accept the rabbis, but most of us are doing it according to what was handed down in the Talmud, right? And so so in the Bible, right, it says there are 4 mitzvahs that you're supposed to do. The Talmud says there's 4 mitzvahs you're supposed to do for Purim. Where do they derive those mitzvahs? They derive them from the book of Esther, right? So you're supposed to read the Megillah, you're supposed to have a feast, you're supposed to send gifts to your friends, and you're supposed to make gifts to the poor, right? Those are the 4 mitzvahs according to, but you're absolutely right, Lori. Beyond those 4 things, do what you want to do, right? And for Hanukkah, even more. Hold on one second. Come in. Hi, Faith. How are you? Nice to see you. See you soon.
I thought with Purim you were supposed to get so blotto that you couldn't tell, couldn't tell what was right and what was wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
So we'll get there. I hope we'll get there.
I thought that was part of the things that you were supposed to do as well.
Yes, but that is true. But
I
that
never
is
heard that
definitely-
before.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So
Definitely.
And in Mordecai.
More,
right,
yeah,
so,
you're
right,
not
so it's
supposed to be
Ad
able to
Shalom
tell the
Yada,
difference.
right? Until you don't know the difference between blessed is Mordecai and cursed be Haman, right? That's how drunk
Exactly.
you're supposed to get, right?
Exactly.
So yeah, and so I would say, before we get too deeply into that, I'll try to stop myself. But the one thing I'll say, right, is that you won't find that in the book of Esther. What you'll find in the book of Esther is the 4 things that I mentioned,
Okay.
right? You won't get the Ad Shalo Yada until the Talmud, right?
I see. Okay.
Right. So there's a whole, there's no Passover Seder in the Torah, right? Where do we come up with a Passover Seder? That's from the rabbis, right? So are we in fact going to get hit by lightning if we don't do the Seder according to what's in the Haggadah? I mean, I'll let you find out. Well, I mean, actually, I can tell you, right, that I've never in my life done the Seder, quote unquote, exactly as it is in the Haggadah. I'm not even sure that it's possible, right? Because I'm not even
the
sure.
30-minute Haggadah.
Right. So there's the 30-minute Haggadah, right? And then there's the 4-hour Haggadah. Neither of those.
That you're supposed to, and you're supposed to eat lying down.
Right. Right, which I can't do. I don't know about you, but if I eat lying down, I immediately choke. So
yeah.
So there's all kinds of customs, right? As Lori points out, I think very appropriately, I would not necessarily make a hard and fast distinction on that basis between the holidays in the Torah and the holidays after the Torah, right? Because the customs for most of the holidays come from the rabbis.
Okay.
And in part, right, it's because of what we saw last week, right? There are not, like in the Torah, what does it say to do on the evening of Passover? What should we do? It says that we
Search
should.
for chametz.
Well, so good, right? So we should search for the chametz, and we do that today, right? It also says that we should slaughter our Passover offering, right? And paint our doorposts and our lintels with the blood, right? And this should be a rule for all time, it says. But we don't do that so much anymore.
Well, I know that here at 1550, they would be very upset.
Right. I mean, I think animal sacrifice in the common room would not be acceptable.
And
right?
painting my doorpost with blood.
With blood would also be.
Tony would be very upset.
It would be awkward. It would be awkward, right? We don't do that anymore, right? So, so and I think that this is one of those things, right? That's just generally true about religion, right? Which is that religion is simultaneously extremely conservative, right? And eminently adaptable, right? So if religion weren't adaptable, right, it wouldn't survive, right? But if it weren't also conservative to a certain degree, it also wouldn't survive, right? So somehow there needs to be this balancing act at all times, right? And the tradition is constantly struggling with that. So, right. So on one hand, if we don't have access to the 30-minute Seder, there's many people who won't do any Seder at all, right? But if all we had were the 30-minute Seder, right, many people would lose interest. So it's oh, hi.
I'm so sorry.
No problem. Do you need this room?
Oh, yeah. I reserved it, but do you need it?
I can, but I can move somewhere else. What time do you need it?
I need it now.
Oh, you need it now. Okay.
Oh, yeah, but let me see if
The activity room is probably open.
Okay.
Yeah, if it's not, just let me know and I'll move.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So, when you talk about the rabbis, that's, I think, where a lot of the problems come up. One of the biggest arguments I ever had with somebody.
Excuse me one second. I need to move. I didn't realize that this room was. That's okay. I didn't realize that this room was being reserved.
I'm sorry.
So I'm just gonna move myself briefly. No. It's my own. It's my own. Just.
If there was another place I could go.
Yeah. No. It's
totally would.
just fine.
Take your time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Oh, no problem. Let's see if I'm just gonna move into this room.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. No, that's just fine.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you
yep,
so much.
not a problem. All right. Sorry, everybody.
Rabbi Jim,
Yeah, Ellen?
when we do crossover on Zoom, is it the link that we use for all the services?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so to get back to, yes, it's the same link, but Ellen, we can talk about that after, okay? Lori, could you just say again what you were saying?
Yeah, I have to remember. Oh, yeah.
The
When you're
rabbis.
talking about the rabbis, and you have more interpretation available. I was thinking this, but one of the biggest, I guess you'd call it, arguments I was having was with a very observant individual in my workplace. When the situation was that which we will encounter this year, that Pesach begins on Saturday, you're supposed to have found your chametz by 11:03 or whatever the time is on Friday. Well, how do you do Kiddush and Hamotzi on Friday night?
Right.
And we went around and around and around. And I guess I remember this because it turns out I was right and the religious Gaon was not. That you don't want to make it so that people abandon a tradition they would like to keep, but can't quite keep the law as defined by the rabbi.
Right. The rabbi or the rabbis?
the rabbis.
Yeah. Yeah. So what was your solution to this problem?
The solution was, and it turns out that it was correct, that you've cleaned the house and you put your challah, which has been in a plastic bag, on a paper placemat. You do your kiddush, and then you take the whole thing and you throw it outside in the garbage, which is a waste of a good challah, but
At least you get to have some. Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah. I mean, these are the kind of.
I'm going to interrupt. If
Yeah.
you're going to throw out a challah, cut it up into little pieces for the wildlife. I'm sure.
Well, yes, I don't mean necessarily.
Right.
To throw it, right. But the point is that you're, and this is a good example, right, of both of the sort of adaptability, right, and conservatism on one pole, right, and then on the other pole, right, that you've got when you end up with conflicting values, right, you've got the value of finding all your chametz and getting rid of it all, and you've got the value of doing an appropriate celebration of Shabbos, right? When you've got both of those, right, you've got you end up doing this dance, right? And although I think you're correct, Lori, in saying that this is the correct way to do it, I would probably be a little bit more lenient and say whatever way a family wants to resolve that impasse is fine as long as it works for the family, right? And go ahead, Lori, you're muted.
I totally agree. I'm saying that this was the consultation with the authorities that came up with a decision that was workable. To me, I was going to have my challah Friday night, and frankly, we put the rest of the challah in the freezer, but don't tell anybody.
Right. And I have friends, right? I have friends who, when this happened, when this happened in the opposite way, right? When Passover was going to end Passover was going to be over at a particular time, and they weren't going to be able to have pita. They went to this great, huge rigmarole to freeze some pita and sell it so that they would sort of buy back their pita in time to have it right after Pesach. People, the thing to know, right, is that you can be, and this is very difficult sometimes for people who aren't super religious to understand, right, including me sometimes, right, that you can make these sort of legal fictions to get around a lot of different otherwise things that would otherwise be as impasses. All right, so we've talked about Hanukkah and Purim. We've talked about the modern holidays, Yomashawa, Yom Ha'atzmaut, Yom Hazikaron, right? What are some other holidays that might come to mind?
Is Tu B'Shvat a biblical?
Yeah, that's really interesting. No, so Tu B'Shvat is not a biblical holiday. Tu B'Shvat is not really a holiday for the rabbis, right? Tu B'Shvat really becomes a holiday during the time of the Kabbalists. So it's really a mystical holiday. And so if you've participated in a Tu B'Shvat Seder, you might remember, right, that they're like the Passover Seder, right? There are 4 cups of wine, right? And there are also associated foods, right? And these have to do with the various different levels of reality as understood in the Kabbalistic system, right? And so it becomes a holiday for the Kabbalists, and then it becomes a holiday sort of again in the late 20th century when liberal Jews discover Jewish mysticism.
And it's
and
also tied in with environmentalism.
well, that's another one of the reasons why it becomes popular.
Yes, it's actually
yeah.
my favorite.
Yeah, it's a great holiday, and it's talk about a holiday with no thunderbolts, right? Because it's all customs, right? And
Any holiday where what you're supposed to do is eat.
right,
It's okay.
it's eating is good, right? And you know, and it's you know, it's sort of a yearly little introduction to, or you know, a yearly reminder of Jewish mysticism. So you know, it's an interesting thing. It starts, right? Tu B'Shvat is one of the New Years in the rabbinic system, right? So in the rabbinic system, there are 4 New Years for different parts of the year, right? So, you know, we start counting. The beginning of each year is in the spring, right? The first of Nisan, right? There's Tu B'Shvat, right? Is the new year for the trees, right? So this is when we, you know, for tax purposes, right? It's sort of like the fiscal year for trees. Right, the new year as we know it, right? Rosh Hashanah is the new year for kings, and there's always that 4th new year that I can never remember off the top of my head. So give me a second. I'll try to remember. I'll try to recall which one it is. Hold on one second. No, I'm not gonna be able to remember off the top of my head.
The second one after Tu B'Shvat is which?
Well, there's the 3 that I can always remember, right? Is the, you know, the new year, you know, when we start counting years, right? Which is in Nisan, right? The 1st of Nisan, in the spring, and then the new year for kings, right? The coronation day is Rosh Hashanah, you know,
Right.
And then the other one. But let me see if this book has a Tu B'Shvat, which the other one is. I'm sorry that I can't remember off the top of my head. No, I can't remember. I apologize. It's one of those things that I learn every year and then I immediately forget.
Let me see if I can
All right,
find it.
so, but yeah, so Tu B'Shvat, and then the other one that I think is really worth remembering, right, in terms of post-biblical holidays is Tisha B'Av, right, the 9th of Av, right. You can't really call it a holiday, right? It's not a very festive day. It's actually the saddest day of the year, right? It's the day on which we commemorate the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And as the tradition has it, right, the temple in Jerusalem, the first temple and the second temple were destroyed on the same day, right, on Tisha B'Av. And as it turns out, either the tradition has assigned, or by some sort of historical coincidence, or possibly through the sort of perversity of oppressors, right? Other historical calamities have also fallen out on Tisha B'Av. So I have a list of them here. Again, this is the sort of thing that I can remember when there's a list in front of me, but I have a hard time remembering when. So it is said, right, that the Romans crushed the nationalistic Bar Kokhba rebellion, right, on Tisha B'Av in 135 of the Common Era, right, and that in 1190, the entire Jewish population of York, England, was massacred on Tisha B'Av, right? They were the first victims of the blood libel, right? King Edward I banished all Jews from England supposedly on Tisha B'Av in 1290, right? And the edict to banish the Jews from Spain and Portugal, right, was in 1492. That was supposedly also on Tisha B'Av, although it says in this book that all the Jews had left before, actually had left before it went into effect. And then in 1942, it says that the Nazis began deportations from Warsaw to Treblinka, supposedly, aware of the significance of Tisha B'Av. They scheduled it on that day, right? So, so Tisha B'Av is also a very important day in the summer. It's become, right, less important for Reform Jews who, according to their movement, right, they associate it really with the destruction of the temple. And since the Reform movement officially does not welcome the return of the temple, they downplay Tisha B'Av. In the other movements, by and large, there's not necessarily any more of a desire for the restoration of the temple, at least among modern Orthodox and conservative. But there is more of a sense of the historical resonance of that day, right? That we need a day on which we mourn all of our losses, right? And there is a little bit of a controversy, right? Why don't we commemorate the Holocaust, right, on this day? Right? There are people who say we should just sort of roll the Holocaust as another historical calamity into these other terrible events, right? But of course, on the other side, there are those that say, well, the Holocaust was its singular event, right? So I have a teacher who thinks that it was necessary in the 20th century, right, to have Yomashawa, right? His thought is that eventually, over the centuries, right, in a couple of centuries, we'll be back to commemorating it as one more of the historical calamities.
I looked up on Google for the
Thank you.
and it's the 1st of Elul.
Thank you. 1st of Elul, which is remind me of what that is for.
Okay, it's the 6th month of the Hebrew calendar, which usually falls on the late summer, August. According to the Mishnah, this was the new year for animal tithes.
That's right, animal tithes, right? So the plants are the 15th of Shvat, right? The 15th of Shvat is going to be the tithes for plants, and the 1st of Elul is going to be the fiscal year for animals. Thank you, Gila. Okay, great. All right, so let's circle back, right? And
Jim, did you say tithes for the
tithes?
Yes.
Right.
Tithes.
Right, taxes basically,
Oh,
right?
okay.
The tax system, right, was that everyone was supposed to give a 10th of their income, right, to take care of the poor, right, to make it possible for the civil authorities, so on and so forth. Right? And obviously the idea of tithing still exists both in a Jewish tradition, but also in Christian tradition. Go ahead, Maya.
Talking about traditions and bringing the environment into it, I heard something that was new to me the other day, that some people are celebrating a reverse tashlit, that instead of throwing things into the water, we should go to the water and take out the garbage that's in there.
I love it. I love it. That's great. So, maybe you could do both.
Next year for worship and study, we should institute that.
Do a cleanup, right?
Yeah. I think
love
that's
it.
so cool.
It's a great idea.
Skimmers and garbage bags.
Yeah, I have a friend who lives in Connecticut on a sort of a country-ish kind of a road. and we'll take when I go out to visit him, we'll take a run. And he always brings, when he runs on that portion of road, he always brings a garbage bag with him in his pocket, because it's the kind of road that, for whatever reason, people feel some sort of compulsion to throw trash out of their car. So, there's always a fresh supply of crud on the side of the road, and he's, so he's forever picking it up. More power to him. Anyway, all right, so let's go back and let's look at some of the holidays. Let's start with Hanukkah, I guess, just because, in terms of the year, right? That's the one that comes. Well, actually, the one that comes first is Tisha B'Av. I don't think we need to spend that much more time on Tisha B'Av, but all I'll say about Tisha B'Av, right, is that we read. I think I mentioned last week that we read the 5 Megillas, right? The 5 scrolls get read on Purim, right? That's the one that we all read on the scroll of Esther, right? The 3 pilgrimage holidays have scrolls associated with them, right? So on Sukkot we read, or let's start with the other way, right? On Passover, right? We read the Song of Songs, right? Which is really a love song, right? It's a series of love poems, right? On Shavuot we read Ruth, right? Which is a different kind of a love story, right? It's about the acceptance, right? It's about the a foreigner's acceptance of sort of joining the Jews, and the story of the Jews accepting a convert. In sort of anachronistic terms, right? We can call Ruth a convert. Very important text, obviously, for anyone who is a convert to Judaism. Ruth tends to be a very important text. And then at Sukkot, we read the book of Ecclesiastes, right? So what really links all of these scrolls, right, is that in some sort of significant way, they're all quite heterodox, right? They present a perspective on the tradition that's very challenging to the tradition, right? So, like most of the world's great religions, right, there is a strain of emphasis on modesty, shall we say, in Judaism, right? Not as strong as necessarily in Christianity, right? But it's there, right? So what do we do with the Song of Songs, which is frankly erotic, right? There's a real emphasis. Say again? I'm sorry, did someone say something? No, okay. In the case of Ruth, right? Judaism, especially in the late biblical period.
Oh, Rabbi Jim, you got frozen. Can you hear us? Uh-oh.
Went black, he'll come back.
Which was the book of Ruth? What holiday do we read the book of Ruth?
Shavuos.
Shavuot?
Yeah.
Shavuot, okay.
If we turn off our video, Rabbi Jim may be able to come back more easily.
He
Sometimes
can
that
come back without us doing anything.
takes bandwidth.
Can anyone hear Rabbi Jim? I can't hear him.
No, he's not, he fell off somehow. We'll just have to wait.
We have to wait for him.
Okay.
He froze and then he probably has to restart.
Okay. Taking a long time to restart.
It is.
Oh no, somebody stole Rabbi Jim.
They kidnapped him?
It could
Must
be
have.
for ransom.
Oh my goodness. Where did he go? He left.
He's out there somewhere.
I presume he knows he's not here.
I hope he isn't
And
talking.
he does. He surely does. He's a smart man.
What's for lunch, Andrea?
It's really good string beans with garlic.
Ooh,
Ooh, that's
Absolutely delicious. Yeah. And one of my tenants gave it to me. And so it's sitting right here. So I'm doing little snacks.
well,
Oh,
show us, show us.
Oh, I know. See, here we go.
Excellent.
I
Well,
suppose.
there you are, Rabbi Jim.
Everybody,
Here he comes.
my iPad just decided that it was no longer going to be connected to the internet.
Noticed.
This is our very fancy system here at CCB. It just will cut me off at any time. All right, so I apologize, but I'm back. So what I was saying, I don't know how much of it you heard, so I'll start again with Ruth, right? This sort of notion of heterodox use of the scrolls, right? That our tradition is very focused on endogamous marriage, right? Marriage within the group, right? And in the story of Ruth, right, is all about how a Moabite, who's one of the most abhorred, the Moabites are one of the most abhorred groups in the Torah, right? That this woman who is a Moabite becomes the ancestor of King David, right? And then finally, right, the book of Ecclesiastes is an extremely, hello, Ellen, is an extremely Epicurean type of a work, right? It has a very cynical sort of point of view, right? Not at all pious, right? The Esther is the fourth scroll, and the fifth scroll is Lamentations, which we read on Tisha B'Av, right? So we won't talk that much more about Tisha B'Av, but it's also an important reminder.
And that's the Book of Lamentations?
The Book of Lamentations, right? Which was traditionally, it's seen as being written by Jeremiah, right? About the destruction of Jerusalem, right? And the rabbis really focus on why did these terrible things happen to us, right? They happened primarily because of sinat chinam, right? Of baseless hatred within the group, right? Jews hating on other Jews, right? And so whether that's accurate or not is a good question, but it does remind us, right, to sort of focus on not being so much at odds all the time with one another. Might be a nice thing for us to remember vis-a-vis our own country right now.
Mm-hmm.
Jim, I have a peripheral question.
Sure.
From whence came the tropes for the different scrolls?
That's actually a great question. I don't know the answer to that question.
Because they're all different, right?
Because they're all, at least in the Ashkenazi tradition, the tropes are different for the different texts. So Lamentations has its own, right? And very interesting, right, that the book of Lamentations, that it's called Echa, that's the name in Hebrew, Echa, and that trope, that set of cantillation sounds, right, is used for one of the haftarahs before the week before the Shabbat before Tisha B'Av. You're supposed to use that trope for the haftarah, and there are also certain verses in the book of Esther, right? So if you were able to, and it's very hard to tell that this is happening because it happens very quickly. But there are certain verses that where we switch from the goofy trope of Megillah to the very sad trope of Lamentations. So there is that sort of. So when we get to talking about Purim, right, we'll sort of get to what are some of the complicated things about Purim, right? One of them is that there's this undertow, right, of loss in the book of Purim and in the holiday of Purim. The other three Megillas, Shir Shirim, the Song of Songs, Ruth, the book of Ruth, and Ecclesiastes, right, the book of Kohelet, right? Those three books use what are called Shir HaShirim trope, or it's called Shir HaShirim trope, which is just for or it's the trope for the festivals, right? And then the other two tropes are the Haftarah trope, right? And then the Torah trope. And there's a variation of the Torah trope that we use on high holidays, but I understand that that's only for Ashkenazi. I don't know if that's absolutely true, but I've heard that only the Ashkenazi make a distinction between high holiday and regular Torah trope.
Who made up these tropes? Who decided on them?
What's trope?
Trope is the system of, what's in English, the word is cantillation. So the symbols that you see when you're looking at a printed Torah, you'll see the vowels, but then you'll see also another set of symbols, and those correspond to the musical notes that are chanted in the synagogue. So in modern day, Lori, there are people who have notated various trope systems, right? But they are traditional. Right, they have been handed down over, but for instance, the one that I've learned, right? Yeah, so Anne is holding it up, right? So the one that I learned is from the Reform movement, and it is based on a series of tropes written down by Binder, I think is his name. But there are many, many different notations of these things, and so if you listen to Sherry Leffert, and if you're learning with Sherry, you're going to learn Sherry's trope, which is different than my trope, right? So every person's trope is slightly different.
So you can choose. You can pick and choose.
You can pick and choose.
Cool.
As with many things in Judaism, right? There is this sort of idea that you should follow what we call minhag avotenu, right? That you should follow the customs of your ancestors, right? But the reality is, in this day and age, that many of us, people like me, my ancestors were not Jewish, so I have to choose, right, which custom I'm going to follow, right? And many of us who were born Jewish, we're not given necessarily a clear set of traditions, especially if you're a woman, right, of a certain age. You weren't expected to chant Torah, so it's not clear that your father would have taught you a particular trope. So you're in a position of needing to pick your own. So yeah, there's beautiful tropes that I happened to learn the one I learned. I don't think I'm going to take the time to learn another one, but they're beautiful Sephardic tropes that I kind of wish I had learned those instead. But I learned the one I learned. All right. So those, yeah, go ahead, Ann.
I have a friend in Portland whose surname is Troper. So I
Troper.
guess what her husband's ancestors did, I bet.
I guess so. That's awesome. That's awesome.
Huh,
All
I
right,
never
so,
thought about it. I have a college classmate whose last name was Troper.
Oh, interesting.
And I
never
never-
even knew that. I never even knew that was a surname. That's just
And her first name was Esther. So, I mean, who knows?
so I guess she's probably an expert at davening the.
I didn't even know she
chanting.
was Jewish.
Who knows? So anyway, all right. So on Hanukkah, right? On Hanukkah, yeah, we decided we'd start with. So Hanukkah, right? The story of Hanukkah, right? We all know the story of Hanukkah, right? And there's the story of the oil. We all know that story, right? There's the story of the few in the face of the many, right? That the Jews overcame this very powerful army, right? And then we also know the story of the oil, right? The reality is, as I said at the very beginning, right, that the story, the historical reality, right, is very, very complicated and probably not entirely knowable, right? And so, and so there is this sort of sense that we can kind of agree, right, that the story really has to do with the perseverance of the light in the face of the dark, right? And that's all very nice, right? But which side is the light and which side is the dark, right, is very complicated, right? Is it that it was Jews, right, fighting against the Greeks, right? On one hand, yes, that's a very nice story. On the other hand, right, it's unlikely that it was that simple, right? It was likely more of a kind of a civil war, right? And this author here has a nice way of putting it. Right? Was it? I'll just read this too. It's unlikely that King Antiochus, being a Hellenist and a pantheist, would have outlawed the observance of Judaism. Right? People who are pantheists generally were not in the business of saying you have to follow one religion. Right? Instead, the Maccabean conflict probably began as a civil war between Hellenizing Jews and those who remained loyal to tradition. At some point, the Hellenizing Jews called for help from their powerful Syrian patrons. This makes the tale less black and white. And he asked this kind of crucial question: is this a fight between liberals and fanatic fundamentalists? Right? What side are we on in that case? Right? or is it between traditionalists and self-hating assimilationists, right? What side of the conflict are we on in that case, right? So that's one of the things that I think we'll find, which is I think true for both Hanukkah and for Purim, right? Is that although it's pretty clear in simplistic terms which side we want to be on, right? It's not always, when it doesn't take very much delving into the story to find some complicating factors.
Oh, one of the thoughts that was brought to me when I was studying holidays was that the symbolism of the lights, it's not just, it's like a progress of the progress of spiritual enlightenment. Yeah,
right. Yeah, absolutely. Right. And so, and this is, and so the rabbis, I think, do, a reasonable job at kind of universalizing Hanukkah, right? They understand at a certain level, right, that by placing the holiday where they did, right, which was on the 25th of Kislev, right, which is the darkest day in the shortest, in the darkest time of the year, right, that it had to do with a sort of a universal experience, at least in the northern hemisphere, right, of looking forward to the renewal of the earth in spring, right? So this is what they write. When Adam saw the day getting gradually shorter, he said, "Woe to me! Perhaps because I have sinned, the world around me is being darkened and returning to its state of chaos and confusion. This then is the kind of death to which I have been sentenced from heaven. Right? And just, it takes a little bit of, imaginative kind of empathy, right? To get into Adam's worldview, right? That, he's never been through this whole year cycle before, right? So he began observing an 8-day fast. However, he observed the winter equinox and noted the day getting increasingly longer. And he said, this is the world's course. And he set forth to keep an 8-day festivity. Right. And so you're following from
back to Adam.
I'm sorry?
We're tracing it back to Adam.
Right. Back to Adam HaRishon, right? Back to the first person. Right. So the rabbis are clearly understanding, right, that there are festivals of light in all kinds of other traditions. Right. That Hanukkah is not the only one. Right. And also, right, that the motivation for these festivals of light, right, is an anxiety or a kind of a mourning for the death of the world, right? That as the days get shorter, right, it's hard to live when the days are so short. I mean, in Boston, we have it particularly badly. But I noticed that today, right, we light the candles at 5:19, right? So like we're really moving now, or maybe it was 5:21. I mean, it was like, it's, like 10 minutes every week now we're gaining. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
This is something that has bothered me for a while with our services. I noticed that we don't do the candle lighting in the Kiddush as part of the service. Is that because we're supposed to do it at the certain time on our own?
That's a good question. There was a lot, when I first came here, there was a lot of complaining about the service and when we were having it and when we were lighting candles and blah, blah, blah.
Okay.
And so I basically made the decision that we would light the candles before our 6:30 service, right? Even if we weren't supposed to light the candles until like 8 o'clock at night, we would still light the candles at 6:30, right? But the problem became like, well, what do you do on days when you have a 3 o'clock service, or when you're supposed to light the candles at 4 o'clock and you have a 6:30 service? So I said, okay, we're going to light the candles at 6:30 regardless. Since we've been on Zoom, I just haven't bothered with candles. And so when we get back to being in person, God willing, we will get back to lighting candles again. Yeah, go ahead, Ann.
Well, I have my little mini candle lights.
Right, exactly. And so if you have an electric candle in your apartment, if you're at CCB, you can light the candles on your own at the appropriate time. And maybe our next session can be, actually, I think it's time that we do Shabbat now that we've done the other holidays. All right, so let's very briefly talk about, go ahead, Mine.
I as I told you, I have another meeting at 2.
You have another meeting.
We were going to go on, so.
That's great. All right, so you know what? We will close now to keep the time. We won't try to rush through Purim. And so next week we will do Purim. We'll talk about Purim and some of the complications with Purim. And if there's any last thoughts that people have about Hanukkah, I'm happy to entertain them.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Good Shabbos, Mine.
Good Shabbos.
And then we will continue with our conversation about we'll begin discussing Shabbat. And I'll send around. I will endeavor to send around in advance some excerpts from Abraham Joshua Heschel's book Shabbat, or The Sabbath. I think it's in good 50s, 60s English, The Sabbath.
One last thing about Tisha B'Av.
Please.
I was once asked to give a talk on Tisha B'Av as it related to the destruction of the Temple of Solomon. And really what occurred to me was at that time that the rabbis at the time, I think it said 70 sages got together. I find it that it was miraculous that Judaism survived right there. I always felt like that is a miracle that Judaism did not just blip out right at that time. And it did not. That was amazing on the part of the rabbis, I think.
Right.
How they were able to transform the whole tradition, really.
Right. Absolutely. Now, Anne wants to say something. Go ahead, Anne.
Has she read As a Driven Leaf by Milton Steinberg?
Right.
It's a wonderful book about all of that.
Right. So 2 books to read. One is, as Anne said, is As a Driven Leaf. A more recent version of that kind of story is The Orchard by Israeli writer Yochi Brandis. Which is
What
also
was the title of the first thing that Anne said?
As a Driven Leaf by Milton Steinberg. Thank you, Milton Steinberg. I wanted to say Milton Friedman, but I said no, that's that economist. No, Milton Steinberg. Yeah, different Milton. So what I was going to say is that you're absolutely right, Carol. That and I think that as much as anything else, right, is a kind of example of what I was saying before about the kind of this constant tension, right, between adaptability and conservatism, right? And so that the tradition maintains an emphasis, we're still going to read and understand all about the temple and how it works with all the sacrifices and blah, 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 right? And we also recognize that we completely need to change gears and no one's going to do sacrifices. We're going to build up an entirely different system to make this something that's sustainable, right? Bye-bye, Ann. Oh, I missed her. All right, so yes, thank you for bringing that up, Carol, because I do think it's really an important aspect of our tradition. And it's actually interesting that, the degree to which, Judaism, the foundation of Judaism, as we know it, Rabbinic Judaism, is based on this loss, right? That nothing that came after would really have been possible without the destruction of the temple, right? So the restoration of the temple is really a complicated thing to ask for, because does that mean the destruction of everything that came since the destruction of the Second Temple, right? So lots of questions there. All right, so I think we should switch gears. And anyone who would like to stick around and focus on Hebrew, you can pull out prayer book Hebrew the Easy Way, and we will get started with that.
Sorry, Jim, I can't stick around for that today.
Oh, too bad. Bummer. All right. You can watch it on YouTube. It'll be very exciting.
Thanks,
Okay.
Rabbi Jim.
All right. Thanks, Andrea.
Okay, bye-bye.
See you soon. All right. So we were on, I think we were on, we did chapter 2. We looked at the various vocabulary words for chapter 2. Does anyone have any questions about chapter 2? Any of the grammar? Is anyone confused about the difference between masculine and feminine words?
Rabbi Jim?
Yeah.
So a mem and a hey is ma, and it means what?
Ma means what?
It's a mem and a hey.
Exactly.
And it's pronounced ma, and it means what?
Exactly.
And a mem and a yud is who?
Is me, right? And that means who.
Okay, that's a
Yep.
mem and a yud. Is that right?
Yep, exactly. All right, so this is on page, if you look on page 10, right, you will see at the very bottom of page 10, you'll see mi ata, who are you? Right? Or mi ha'em, who is the mother? Okay, so, all right. So let's turn then to page 13. All right, and we will anticipate next week when we are going to be talking about Shabbat, right? Because the blessings that we say as part of the Kiddush, right, as the sanctification of Shabbat, are the Hamotzi, is what we call it. We tend to call it Hamotzi, right? The blessing over bread. And Borei Peri Hagafen is what we call the blessing over wine. All right, so you'll see, right, that at the beginning of each of these blessings, right, you'll see that they are the same, right? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, right? Those 6 words, right, are going to be some of the most repeated words that you see
Now,
in the
I
prayer
have
book.
a question
Yeah.
about universe.
Yes. Good.
Were they aware that there was a universe?
Oy, good question, Yeva. I think, the question is who was aware,
Yeah.
right? So the word Olam, I'm not a historian of the language enough to tell you when it acquired the meaning of universe, right?
Okay.
But even in the ancient world, right, people realized that there was
Something
space,
more.
there was something beyond the world, right?
Right.
And so they had a name for it. And as far as I know, I don't want to, I'm sure that I can find a scholar somewhere who's going to tell me I'm wrong. But as far as I know, right, the word olam is the word that people use for the everything, right? For the everything, right? So olam can mean worlds, right? But it also means universe, and it also means forever. So when we're talking about everything, right, it's really a time and space everything.
Right.
Right. It's not really a concept for which we have a single word that I'm aware of in English. Right. The whole of the time-space continuum, right? If you really, right.
Right.
So
and that's distilled into that one word.
Exactly. So you could certainly say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. You could say, blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the entire time-space continuum, right? That might be accurate. It doesn't slip off the tongue.
Right, so universe does.
So universe is a little bit easier to get through. Yeah, go ahead, Ellen.
What's the difference between Kiddush and Kaddish?
Okay, that's a great question. Okay, so Kiddush, right? And this gets you right to the reality that in Hebrew, the consonants can be the same, the vowels can be different, and you have a different word, right? So a Kaddish, right? A Kaddish, which does mean sanctification or something along those lines, right? The Kaddish refers to the prayer that is the transitional prayer between parts of the service. And there are various versions of the Kaddish that come up at different points in the service. And so at some point we can go through all those Kaddishes, right? most of them will show up in the course of in the daily prayer book.
And what's
Right.
Kiddush?
And then Kiddush also means sanctification, right? But it has to do with the ceremony on a Shabbat or a holiday that initiates the meal.
Right.
Right. So we have generally an actual kind of on Friday night, right? We have a sort of a longer blessing, right? That talks about the two aspects of Shabbat. The first one having to do with Ma'aseh Bereshit, with the acts of creation, right? And the association between Shabbat and the seventh day of creation. Then also Yitziat Mitzrayim, right? That Shabbat is a reminder of our exodus from Egypt, right? That what we get from having gone through Pesach, right, and leaving slavery is that we get Shabbat. Right? It's not that we don't work anymore, right? It's that we balance work with rest.
Is it Kiddush usually the bread and the wine?
And then it's bread and the wine. Exactly. Right. So in some families, right, they don't bother with the longer Kiddush blessing. They just do the bread.
They just do the bread and the wine.
They do candles, bread, and wine, and that's it. Right. Other families
for the Kiddush.
Right. Exactly. Okay. And so what you see here, right, this blessing formula, this first 6 words, right, is consistent among many blessings, especially blessings which are I forget exactly how they're, but blessings of enjoyment, right? That where you're acknowledging the role of God in creating the conditions for life to be as pleasant and as amazing as it is. Right. So one of them is Hamotzi Lechem min haaretz, right? Who brings forth bread from the earth. Right. Such an interesting, right? It doesn't say, who bakes the bread or who gives us bread, right? It's Hamotzi Lechem min haaretz. Right. So what does God actually arrange to bring out of the earth?
The grain.
Grain, right?
And in fact, I was taught that you want to do these blessings because the grain needs to be blessed. And so it's in other words, everything you need to do these blessings because the grain is waiting to be blessed.
That's interesting. I haven't heard that.
And so you do a mitzvah. I mean, it's a mitzvah.
Yeah.
To bless the wine and the bread. It's because those elements were alive.
Right.
And so they're waiting to be blessed.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's interesting. I haven't heard that, but I really like it. The thing that I'm more familiar with, which is along those lines, right, is that unless you say a blessing over your food, right, it's as though you've stolen it, right? You haven't really thanked God for it, right? But what really always strikes me about these 2 blessings in particular, right, but really about all of the blessings that are about food, right, is that it's very clear that we're talking, as you mentioned, Eva, right, that we're talking about the raw materials, right? Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, right? Borei peri hagafen. What does God create? God creates the fruit of the vine. Right. What does God do? God brings the grain out of the earth, right? But there's a whole other set of processes.
And these were all alive.
I'm sorry. Yes,
these were all alive.
Right.
And we are consuming it for our life
Right.
And, so there's,
Yep, I get it, but what I'm stressing, right, is the fact that it's not done when it's not enough,
right.
Right. We actually have to process the grapes into wine, right. We actually have to, process the grain and turn it into flour and combine it with other elements, right, in order to make the bread, right. So all of this stuff is a process of a partnership between the Holy One and humans.
And it's a blessing that we have them.
Exactly. And so we need to, that's part of what we're saying a blessing for. Go ahead, Ellen.
So bread is lechem?
Lechem. In the back of your mouth. Lechem.
Lechem. And how do you say from?
Right. I'm sorry?
How do you say from? From.
Min. Yeah. So I'll say this word, right? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Why doesn't everyone say that once? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Okay. Hamotzi.
Hamotzi.
Motzi. Hamotzi.
Hamotzi.
Lechem. Lechem. Min. Min. Haaretz. Haaretz.
Say no, I'm not interested.
Say again, Carol?
I'm sorry, that was a mistake.
No problem. Okay. All right. And then the other one, right, over the wine is I won't bother with the Baruch Ataz, right, is Borei Peri Hagafen. Borei Peri Hagafen. Okay. If you're Sephardic, you say Hagefen. If you're Ashkenazi, you say Hagafen. Why? I don't know. But if you hear someone say Hagefen, don't say you're wrong. Say, oh, are you Sephardic? One thing I've noticed is that people, this is, as I've learned more, I've learned that I know that I actually, that I just know more than I used to, and it's just a reminder of how little I knew before.
Yes,
just a reminder for me that humility is always the way to go.
The rules of Pesach for Sephardi is different too.
Right. Although now, by and large, right, most American Jews who follow sort of the conservative people who actually are caring about Passover, a lot of them who follow the conservative rules now will be able to eat according to Sephardi rules as opposed to Ashkenazi rules. I only just last year sort of switched over, but because I was mentioning minhag avotenu before, the rules of your ancestors. Well, in as much as I have Jewish ancestors, they're Ashkenazi, so you shouldn't eat rice and beans. But anyway.
And if you're Spanish, you eat rice and beans.
Right? Sephardi eat rice and beans. They eat lentils. They eat green peas and all kinds of legumes and so on and so forth. So I always saw that as basically like if you eat all that stuff, then it's just an excuse to eat less meat. And I always thought of Passover as an excuse to eat as much meat as you can in 1 week because I don't eat a lot of meat otherwise. Yeah, go ahead, Lois.
Okay, so you're following a tradition as opposed to a law.
Yes. Well, actually, that's a really interesting question that you're bringing up, Lois, which, it would be a good thing to bring up in the larger group, right? Which is what's the difference between a custom and a law?
Right.
And in the Jewish sort of traditional Jewish circles, in some ways, right, customs are actually stricter than laws, right? And that when you're talking about a custom, right? You can't change a custom because it's a custom, right? That's what your father did, that's what your mother did, so that's what you do, right? Whereas a law, right? The law is part of the halachic system, right? And as a part of the system, right, we can find ways to interpret the law so that our behavior changes. Right? Whereas the custom is explicitly about behavior, right? And so it's not something you just change. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but it is kind of interesting how the conservative movement decided, right, that they were going to change the law about Passover, probably understanding that many people had already changed their customs, right? So they were changing the law to match the customs of the people on one hand, right? And also that many people who hadn't changed their custom would not now change their custom because the law changed, if that makes sense. So law and custom are definitely connected, but they're not the same, if that makes sense.
So there's a lot to be said also with gluten intolerance.
Right. A lot of the reason for that change, right, is the rise of gluten intolerance and the rise of vegetarianism. Right. People who are vegetarian have a little bit of a hard time during Pesach finding protein, right? If you can't eat legumes, because that's a primary source of protein for people who are vegetarians. And people who are gluten intolerant, right? Or if you've just made a
eat quinoa.
Right, eat quinoa, but even quinoa was, for the Orthodox Union, quinoa was controversial because it was akin to a grain. It's not, everyone understands that from a botanical point of view, it's not a grain, but it kind of behaves like a grain. So like, are you setting up a slippery slope where if you allow quinoa, then that inevitably is going to lead to a situation where everyone's eating rice. And what is interesting, I mean, we can laugh at that kind of like, slippery slope argument, but the fact of the matter is that now the conservative movement says it's okay to eat rice as well as quinoa. So they, that concern wasn't necessarily misplaced. Go ahead, Lois.
I was under the impression that it was about 15 years ago that they said for us to make our own tradition, to bring something to the table, meaning Pesach.
Yeah. In the conservative movement, you mean?
Yes.
That could be, because I'm not actually a conservative Jew, so that could have been that they did say that, and so yeah, I don't know. The conservative movement has been struggling with this. Obviously, it's not a new thing.
That's true. Yeah, it really is.
I mean, I remember in this was back in my Reform days, about 20 years ago. When I first learned, right, that the Jews had begun to, Ashkenazi Jews had begun to realize that the Sephardim were all eating, what they call kitniyot. And the Ashkenazi Jews were like, wait, if they can eat it, why can't we?
Is this because of Israel with the Sephardic? And,
in part, right? In part because, and this is, it is actually an interesting story, right? From the point of view of the fact that the Sephardim in Israel were really second-class citizens for many, many years, right? And the Ashkenazim really dominated both the secular and the religious community. And as the Sephardim grew in sophistication and in political power, right, their customs became more well-known and more widespread, and we see this sort of mixing, right, of traditions that is inevitable, right, in a society that is going to have that has these two groups, and they don't remain strictly segregated.
In my
All right.
community, in
Yeah,
my
go ahead.
community, they had, the Ashkenazi basically went to one of the synagogues and the Sephardic went to a different synagogue.
Right,
So-
and that's still the case in many situations, right? Because the prayer service is sufficiently different between Sephardic synagogues and Ashkenazi synagogues for it to be not entirely. I mean, it's not. It's would it be as different as a conservative versus reform? I don't know. I'm really not in either of those camps. But every time I tried to learn to daven from a Sephardic Siddur just to sort of learn that tradition. And it's very difficult to daven from that Siddur in an Ashkenazi oriented synagogue. The order of the prayers is different, especially towards the beginning of the service. There are different elements, and so it's not simple. But yes, there is mixing. There are definitely Ashkenazim who prefer Sephardic prayer and vice versa. So you're going to have that mixing.
Thing, the Aleph base and Aleph bet.
Right. Exactly. All right. So let's move on to chapter 3.
I believe also,
right?
but thank you very much.
You're welcome, Los. All right. So chapter 3, page 14. Let's look at the vocabulary words for this, and then you can then work on chapter 3 over the course of the next week, right? So again, every time you have the opportunity to read these words, go ahead and read them, right? Mizot miata ani Moshe, right? The more you read out loud, the easier it will be to read out loud, and the more words that you'll begin to recognize as you go through the Siddur during services. So we see Abraham, right? So one of the important sets of words in the Siddur is the names of the matriarchs and the patriarchs. Right? In traditional Judaism, it's only the patriarchs. In our liberal Judaism, it's also the matriarchs. Right? So Avraham is an important one, right? And we see how that's spelled. Ela, right, is these. Davar is a great word, and the plural is divarim. Right? Divarim is the name of Deuteronomy in Hebrew, right? Words, right? But davar is also a thing, right? So we have, so we can talk about these things, or we can talk about these words. And so in Hebrew, right, there's an emphasis on the thinginess of words. And then we have some pronouns, right? Haim and hain. They masculine, they feminine. As in many languages, if you have a mixed group of males and females, the plural for they is haim, right? Is the masculine plural, right? That's the unmarked, as they say in linguistics, the unmarked term is the masculine. So you won't see hain very often. It does occur, but it's not super common. Very important word, the, and, right? You probably already noticed that many words in Hebrew are not separate words, right? What are separate words in English are particles in Hebrew, right? And some of those particles are prefixes and some of them are suffixes. So one of the most important of them is the ha, right? We said min haaretz, from the earth, right? So the is the letter hey, generally with the sound ha underneath, ah underneath it, so ha, right? There are many prepositions, right? But also this word the. before the letters mem, bet, and pay, the word and is u. So when you say u, if you see uvaruch, right, or you see uven, right, don't be surprised that you say u as opposed to v, because before these particular letters, you can't have a v. You have the word, the letter vav changes to an u. Leah is one of our matriarchs. And then Torah, right, you'll see Torah again and again. All right, any questions about these words? And yeah, go ahead, Ellen. You're muted though, Ellen. Ellen, you're muted. There you go. You're still muted. There you go.
Now can you hear me?
Yep.
So they masculine is haim and they feminine is heen.
Hain. Hain.
Hain and the feminine is heen.
No, not heen. Hain.
That's
Same vowel,
masculine.
same vowel sound. The only difference is the end consonant is different. It's a mem. It's a mem for the masculine and a nun for the feminine.
Okay.
But the vowel sound is exactly the same. It's an A. Okay. Now you'll see on page 15, right, that when you see the suffix im, that's the masculine plural. So divarim, I told you about divarim, right, and melech, melachim. And you can see, don't worry too much about it, but you'll see that under the words, right, the vowels change. Right? The vowels will change when we add the plural suffix. Don't worry too much about being able to predict them. Just be ready for them to change and not get worried about the change.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So the feminine of they.
Yeah.
Is that nun? Is that a nun safit?
Yes, that's a nun sofit. Right. So there are a few letters, right, that have forms that only arrive at the end of the word. I like to think of them as sort of like reverse capital letters, but it's only for a few of them. Mem is one of them. Nun is another, right? Kaf is one. Pei is one.
Right.
All right. So, and then you'll see also on page 15, right, that feminine plural is generally ot. So, all right, sot, right, and shabbatot. All right, but there are, as is the case in every language, right, there are irregular, except for maybe Esperanto, right, there are exceptions, right, there are exceptional words. So it's definitely worth looking at the list on page 17, right, to see the plural versions of words, so that you be on 16 and 17, so that you begin to recognize, actually no, all of them are on 17, so that you'll begin to recognize the various plural forms when they come along. All right. And then you will, definitely go through the rest of chapter 3. All right. And then we will review chapter 20, page 22 next week. which is it introduces some of the liturgy. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks everybody.
Can I say one last thing?
Sure.
Going all the way back to, was Heva talked about Olam.
Yes.
Were they aware of the universe? Or I think that's what she said. Were they aware of the universe?
That's what I said.
Okay, and I just wanted to say that they were very tuned into the constellations.
Yes.
They knew, they were very sophisticated at that time.
Well, which time are you talking about, Carol? Not because I disagree with you, but I just want to know which time you're talking about.
I was thinking of the biblical period in Egypt.
Yeah. Yes. I mean,
Yeah,
right. It's definitely in the biblical period, and even more so, right, in the rabbinic period. Astronomy was definitely something that people paid attention to.
Yes.
And obviously, in some cases, it turned into astrology, but even astrology started as astronomy.
Well, they were very tuned into the constellations.
Very much so. Very much so.
And they had that awareness, and also the level of knowledge of mathematics.
Right.
Was remarkable.
Right.
At that time. So.
And remember that there was no electric light, right? So on a clear night when there were no clouds, everything was visible. It's very difficult, right, for us living in Brookline to have a real concept, right, of how bright the night sky would be, when there's a full moon, and all the stars are shining.
When prior to moving to Brookline in June, I lived on a farm in northern Massachusetts, and it was quite extraordinary. Night sky was an extraordinary.
Yeah. That's a big loss moving to the city.
I hope it isn't sacrilegious to say this. If it is, please tell me. But the pyramids of Giza are aligned with the constellation Orion.
Really?
Alignment. Please,
that's amazing.
You don't have to take it from me. You can stop.
No, I believe you. That's incredible. Yeah.
And they're still there.
Yeah.
Right. So are the stones in Stonehenge. They're not with Orion, but they are with the equinoxes.
Right.
Yeah.
So yes.
It's a mistake to think of the people then as Stone Age people. It's just a mistake. They're very sophisticated.
I mean, I think we can think of them as Stone Age, but we have to remember that just because they lived in the Stone Age doesn't mean that they weren't incredibly sophisticated in the way they understood their world.
They were very tied into the heavens and the constellations.
Right. And they understood our worlds, and I think it could be hard to remember, but I think it's very important to remember, right, that with all we've quote unquote gained in terms of our knowledge of the universe, right, there's also certain things that we've lost track of. It can be, it can be hard to remember our humility, but I think it's important to do so. So, all right, thank you, everybody.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Thank you, Reverend Jim.
I'll see you tonight if you're coming.
6
Okay,
o'clock. 6 o'clock.